G'day folks, it's time for a little bit of RAV4 work this afternoon. I've already finished bolting the seats back into blue, and as you can see, he's sitting out the front waiting anxiously for me to get back. Actually he won't be driven until tomorrow, but I've got a temp reg permit and everything, so he's going to the mechanic for inspection and pre-examination for roadworthy. I've already picked a few things like the rear shocks and windscreen. I've got the money to actually do all that sort of thing now, so I've got a feeling instead of getting the F100 I might just get blue on the road anyway. Even though Betty's doing okay, that's our next point. We're going to have a look at her top end and see if the camshafts are actually worn or if the valve shims were just not set properly when the head was done. So let's get on to that one. Yeah, also picked up a manual just for shits and giggles. I've rarely ever had to look at a manual working on a car, but it does help to have things like torque and assembly stages. This covers everything up to 2010, so it's quite useful. You got things like your settings, tune-up maintenance, tyre wear patterns, tells you what suspension's gone, that sort of thing. Tow in, tow out. Yeah, various tools, you name it. Even got a nice little basically a wall of carnage for what happens to spark plugs. You've got detonation, high speed glazing, more detonation, or pre-ignition. To me pre-ignition's also detonation, but yeah. Come on, don't fall on the floor. Yeah, they pretty much put out a manual for every kind of car, so it's well worth getting. Covers the V6 model as well, the newer models with the plastic intake manifold. I like the old RAVs. I wouldn't mind the next model along, but they're a bit more tedious. They basically built a whole new car from scratch rather than using a parts box assembly. The first generation RAV4 is essentially a mixture of Camry, Corolla and Celica parts really. It's a parts bin car, so a lot of it's interchangeable. It's most of it's completely interchangeable across the board. So I like the old ones more than the newer ones, but you have a harder time interchanging parts. But anyway, what I'm doing is taking the rocker cover off, or the valve cover, cam cover, whatever you want to call it, and we're going to have a look at the valve clearances. I've got to remove that. I've already loosened that off. That's the throttle cable support. Remove crankcase vent number 1, PCV. I'm going to have to remove that, which is an engine lifting hook. That bolt there is going to block everything, so I'm just going to take the big one out and take the whole lot off. And I should be able to lift this out. I've also lifted the power steering reservoir and brought that up. The power steering's getting awfully dark now. I've noticed you're starting to get a bit heavier in the steering too, so particularly compared with blue. Blue is a lot lighter, so I've got a feeling, even though she turns positive, that is, it's still red. It's not metallized, but it's not the healthiest, so I think the power steering pump might be having a bit of a hard time. It'll be time for a power steering flush at the very least. Anyway, I've got to take these 4 big nuts off, and then I'll be able to lift the rocker cover off, cam cover. I might have to lose that lifting hook as well, just so I can bring it out. Okay, well after a bit of cleaning and inspection, I've been able to crank her over without ignition or fuel, and there's plenty of oil. Oil pressure comes up straight away. Unfortunately that's going to run right down behind the engine. I'm going to require another degrease, but plenty of oil coming up here. I just don't think they're set right. The cam lobes are showing a little bit of wear, but they're not exactly flogged out like I was expecting. I just don't think they set the clearances properly. You can see that they move. On top there is the shim, underneath is the lifter, or bucket I guess you'd call it. So I'm going to take some measurements with my feeler gauges and just see what they actually read and what they're supposed to read. this side's the intake and this side's the exhaust, so yeah, something's not right. It's certainly very noisy. Everything else seems to be fine. I'm getting tons of oil, and yeah, not quite right anyway. Even on this end here, there is wear on the cams, but it's not excessive. Like, they're not scored or severely damaged. I don't know how well set these spider gears are, although the service bolt hole, it's almost lined up. It might be slightly out, but yeah, that's another thing. This little gear here is spring loaded. It's in 2 sections, and it's spring loaded to prevent chatter between the teeth. So that could be another issue. Maybe they didn't set the spider gear properly, but that means pulling the top end apart. Well, at least pulling this cam out. So that's sort of a last resort at this stage. For now, I'm just going to, well, yeah, just check the clearances, make sure the clearances are right. If the clearances come up alright, or within tolerance, I'll consider pulling this cam out and retensioning the spider gear and then setting it back in. It'll be fairly tricky, but it's not impossible with the equipment that I've got. Anyway. Yeah, tons of oil. It's coming out everywhere. And it's going to go running down the back of the block again. Not a tremendous amount at this end, but still it's there. Yeah, again, the oil light goes out as soon, within a couple of revolutions just cranking, the oil light goes out. If the oil light stayed on just cranking it over, I'd be worried. If the oil light stayed on for more than a couple of revolutions after the engine fires, I'd be really worried. But I don't believe that there is a issue with oil pressure from the pump. I believe this is a setting issue, because they have had the head off before. Whoever did it charged them a VRS kit and clearly didn't install the rocker cover gasket or seals, because they are way older than this head job is. Yeah, whoever did the head just balls it up essentially. That's all I can say. They just screwed up. I'm also going to take the spark plugs out and run a compression test as well, just for the hell of it. At least see if compression's equal or if one cylinder's getting lazy. Again, compression test won't explain anything to do with the rattle, but it'll just explain why the idle's a little bit rough. But then again, excessive valve clearance will cause a rough idle anyway. And that's the underside of the cover. There's a steel baffle that's been riveted into it, like most of them. And I'm going to try and clean as much of that crap off as I can. That, or just leave it be. Don't touch it and just let it come off gradually and let the oil filter catch it, which is probably the safest thing to do. But you can see they've slathered the gasket, new or old, more than likely old. They've just slathered it in grey max and stuck it back in there. New gasket, you shouldn't have to cover it with sealant. There are a few key points, particularly where the half moons go into the cylinder head. You do put a bit of sealant on there, like there, and there. That's about it. This covering the whole gasket with sealant is indicative of somebody reusing an old gasket after they've already charged the customer for a VRS kit. Not good. Okay, well, I'll be buggered if I can find a valve on here that's been shimmed incorrectly. Looks like they actually did a decent job of it. There are a few which are on, like, wildly within tolerance, but they're at either end of the scale. Some of them are a little bit tighter than others, and some of them are at the far end of the scale as far as being loose, but still, loose is better than tight, and they're not that bad. Looking at the clearances in here, if I go to, say, the exhaust valve, maximum clearance is 0.38 millimeters, or 0.015 inches, which is what I've got here, 0.015. They're old gauges, but they're still good. And again, I can't even get that under that exhaust cam. Nothing. If I go down one size, it'll just slip in nicely, but if I stick with the maximum, it won't even go in. So that's definitely not the issue, and I've gone over everything from end to end, exhaust and intake, checking them against their respectable clearances, and they're all within spec, all of them. All these caps are tight, I've checked them all. These scissor gears are my only real suspect here. I'm guessing this may have been released by accident and not tensioned properly, so as the cam rolls over the springs, the cam tries to snap over. If you imagine the upward force of the valve springs pushing on the lobes, once it tries to tip over the 12 o'clock position, it'll just go click and cause the clatter clatter. That's the only thing I can think of. I'm also going to take the timing cover off and make sure that the timing pulley hasn't worked loose or simply not been tightened. That's about it. Apart from that, the only other thing I can think of is maybe wrist pin or gudgeon pin noise, which I hope not. I hope the bottom end's alright, but who knows. Yeah, worst case scenario, it's not actually the top end, it could be wrist pins or something more serious. It does still sound like top end. It doesn't sound like it's coming from the crankcase. You get a different sound from the crankcase. So that's what I'm going to be looking at next. Maybe not tonight. It's not far off getting dark, but at least now I know the valves and the cams are still fine. Anyway, that'll do for now. We'll make a part 2 later, and yeah, keep on going. Thanks for watching.